They told us the hunger was the only thing that drove them. They told us that the infected were nothing more than biological machines fueled by a singular, ravenous need to consume warm flesh. But looking down from the jagged, crumbling ridge into the valley of Sector 7, I realized the intel was a lie. The silence was heavier than the gray, toxic fog rolling off the irradiated river below. It wasn't the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of anticipation. The wind carried the stench of ozone mixed with the copper tang of old blood, a sensory warning that prickled the hairs on the back of my neck. I adjusted the strap of my rifle, the leather biting into my shoulder, and peered through the cracked lens of my binoculars. What I saw defied every rule of the wasteland. Down there, amidst the skeletons of bombed-out skyscrapers and twisted rebar, they weren't roaming. They weren't hunting. Thousands of them, a sea of gray, rotting skin and tattered clothing, stood perfectly motionless in concentric circles. They were facing outward. They weren't trapped, they were deployed. This wasn't a horde, it was a garrison. And whatever lay in the center of that breathing, necrotic formation was important enough to override their primal instinct to eat. We began our descent, boots crunching softly on the pulverized concrete that covered the world like snow. The air grew colder as we neared the perimeter, the unnatural chill seeping through my hazmat suit. My squad mates, Miller and Vance, moved like ghosts beside me, their breathing ragged over the comms, betraying the terror we were all suppressing. We had to pass within inches of them. Close enough to smell the decay, close enough to see the clouding cataracts in their unblinking eyes. The plan was madness: slip through the gaps in their ranks, relying on the theory that their sensory perception was currently enslaved to a higher signal. I took the first step into the crowd. The creature to my left was a man once, wearing the shredded remains of a transit worker's uniform. His jaw hung slack, swaying slightly in the breeze, but he did not turn. He didn't lunge. He stared fixedly at the horizon, vibrating with a low, subaudible frequency that I could feel in my teeth. It was like walking through a minefield of statues made of meat. The smell was suffocating, a thick, sweet rot that coated the back of the throat. As we pushed deeper into the circle, the architecture changed. The ruins of the old city gave way to sleek, black obsidian monoliths that had erupted from the ground, alien and terrifyingly pristine against the backdrop of destruction. The infected were denser here, shoulder to shoulder, a wall of flesh fusing together. We had to squeeze through, physically pushing aside cold, stiff limbs. Every touch sent a jolt of panic through my nervous system, expecting the snap of teeth, but they remained dormant. Their attention locked on the perimeter. Finally, we broke through the inner ring. The center of Sector 7 wasn't a crater or a nest. It was a door. A massive, circular blast door set into the ground, pulsing with a rhythmic, violet light that illuminated the undersides of the zombies' chins, giving them a demonic, underlit cast. The ground hummed. And then I saw it. The one zombie that wasn't looking out. It was kneeling before the door, its forehead pressed against the cold steel, weeping black ichor. It turned its head slowly, locking eyes with me. It didn't scream. It smiled. And in that moment, the ground beneath us began to open, and I realized they weren't guarding the door to keep us out. They were guarding it to keep something else in. The violet light exploded upward, blinding us, and for the first time in 10 years, the infected screamed in unison, not in hunger, but in worship. The sound wasn't just a noise, it was a physical dismantling of reality. The unison scream of 10,000 infected throats created a shockwave that felt less like acoustic pressure and more like a tectonic shift inside my skull. It was a frequency of pure, unadulterated ecstasy that shattered the glass of my gas-masked peripheral vision and drove spikes of agony deep into my inner ear. I didn't have time to process the betrayal of gravity before the world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of violet luminance and rushing air. The blast door, that colossal iris of steel, hadn't opened to reveal a room, it had opened to reveal an abyss. A throat of the earth that swallowed us whole. We fell. It wasn't the flailing, chaotic tumble of a clumsy accident, but a surreal, guided descent into a column of light that seemed to possess a viscosity of its own. The air around me roared, not with the wind of velocity, but with the displacement of ancient, stagnant atmosphere that smelled of ionized metal and something sickly sweet, like honey poured over a festering wound. My stomach slammed into my throat, hovering there in the vacuum of weightlessness as the obsidian walls of the shaft blurred past. Through the spiderweb cracks in my visor, I saw glimpses of the shaft's architecture. It wasn't jagged rock or poured concrete. It was ribbed. Massive, black arches intertwined like the ribcage of a leviathan, pulsating with that rhythmic violet vein that pumped light instead of blood. We were sliding down the esophagus of the world. Time distorted. The fall could have lasted seconds or hours. The terror rendered the concept of chronology obsolete. I remember clawing at the empty air, my gloved fingers grasping for purchase where there was none. My scream lost entirely within the lingering echo of the infected horde above. Their worship followed us down. It reverberated against the tunnel walls, a chant of devotion that vibrated against the plating of my chest rig. The realization hit me harder than the G-force. They weren't screaming in anger because we had trespassed. They were screaming in celebration. We were the offerings. We were the keys they had been waiting to turn. Impact. It came not with a bone-shattering crunch, but with a jarring, magnetic deceleration that nearly snapped my neck. I slammed onto a surface that rang like a cathedral bell, a heavy, metallic grid suspended over a darkness so absolute it hurt to look at. My rifle clattered away, sliding across the grating, the sound echoing for an eternity in the vastness. I lay there, gasping, the rebreather unit on my back hissing violently as it struggled to filter the sudden change in atmospheric pressure. My vision swam, black spots dancing in a tango with the fading violet afterimages. Every muscle in my body was coiled tight, waiting for the teeth, waiting for the rending of flesh, but nothing came. Just the hum. A low, throbbing bass note that seemed to emanate from the core of the planet itself. Miller? Vance? My voice was a croak, unrecognizable even to myself inside the helmet. The comms loop was a wash of static, a white noise ocean that sounded like rain on a tin roof. I rolled onto my back, groaning as the bruises began to bloom across my ribs. Above, the aperture we had fallen through was a distant, shrinking pinprick of purple light, a dying star in a synthetic sky. We were miles deep. The air down here was cold, but not the winter chill of the surface. This was a sterile, preservationist cold, the temperature of a morgue or a server room. I forced myself to sit up, my head spinning like a gyroscope off its axis. Miller was a heap of hazard orange and tactical black a few yards away, curled into a fetal ball. I could hear him hyperventilating over the local proximity channel now, short, sharp gasps that fogged his visor from the inside. Vance was already on his feet, though he swayed like a drunkard, his weapon raised but pointing at nothing. He was turning in slow, bewildered circles, his posture screaming of a mind unable to process the data it was receiving. I followed his gaze, and the breath left my lungs for the second time. We were standing on a suspended catwalk. A precarious island of steel mesh in the center of a cavern so immense that our suit lights failed to find the ceiling. But it wasn't a cave. It was a machine. Stretching out into the gloom were rows upon rows of cylindrical towers, stretching up into the darkness and down into the abyss below. They were illuminated by faint, amber status lights that blinked in complex, non-repeating patterns. Bridges of glass and chrome connected them. A spiderweb of technology that looked far too advanced to have been built by the civilization that crumbled 10 years ago. This wasn't a bunker. It was a hive. I dragged myself to my feet, my boots magnetizing slightly to the floor with each step, a feature my suit didn't have. Implying the floor itself was manipulating us. I stumbled over to the railing and looked down. The fog here wasn't gray. It was a luminous blue mist that swirled around the base of the towers. obscuring whatever lay at the bottom of this technological canyon. "Sarge," Vance whispered, the word trembling. "Look at the towers. Look inside them." I adjusted the focal length on my visor, zooming in on the nearest cylinder, about 50 meters away. The surface wasn't metal. It was a transparent polymer, thick and clouded with condensation. But as the amber light pulsed, I saw the silhouette within. It was suspended in a viscous fluid, a tangle of tubes and wires inserted into its spine and skull. It wasn't human. Not anymore. It was massive, perhaps 10 feet tall, with elongated limbs and a carapace that looked like it had been grown rather than forged. But the face was human. Distorted, stretched, frozen in a silent scream of agony, but human. And it was one of thousands. Every tower, as far as the eye could see, held a specimen. "They aren't guarding a weapon," I muttered, the horror distinct and cold in my veins. The realization washed over me, recontextualizing every moment of the last decade. The surface, the ruins, the shuffling hordes of eating machines, they were just the runoff. They were the waste product. The zombie outbreak wasn't the event. It was the camouflage. Miller finally spoke, his voice cracking. Are they sleeping?" "No," I said, watching the fluid in the nearest tank bubble as the creature within twitched a finger the size of a pry bar. "They're incubating." The silence of the cavern was suddenly broken by a mechanical hiss. The sound of hydraulics engaging. The catwalk beneath us shuddered, and the amber lights on the towers turned a deep, angry crimson. The hum grew louder, rising in pitch until it was a whine that set my teeth on edge. The layout of the catwalks began to shift, rotating like the gears of a clock, realigning the path. We weren't trespassers who had slipped in unnoticed. The system knew we were here. The system had accepted the delivery. I gripped my rifle, checking the chamber, though the gesture felt pathetically futile against the scale of this place. "Move!" I ordered, pointing toward a heavy blast door at the end of the catwalk that had just hissed open, revealing a corridor bathed in sterile white light. "We can't stay in the open. If those tanks open, we're dead." We ran. Our boots hammered against the metal, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the chamber. I risked one glance back as we sprinted. The kneeling zombie from the surface, the one who had smiled, had not fallen with us. But on a monitor mounted to the pillar we just passed, I saw a grainy feed of the surface. The zombies were still standing in their circles. But they weren't looking out anymore. They were all looking down. Looking at the ground beneath their feet. They knew. They knew we were in the belly of the beast. And as we crossed the threshold into the white corridor, the heavy door slammed shut behind us, sealing us in with a pneumatic hiss that sounded final. We were alive, but we were no longer survivors of the wasteland. We were lab rats in a maze that had been running beneath our feet the entire time. The hiss of the hydraulic seal was not just a sound. It was a physical sensation that vibrated through the soles of my boots and settled deep in the marrow of my bones. It was the sound of a tomb sealing from the inside. For a moment, the only acoustic reality in that blindingly white corridor was the heavy, fluid thump of the locking mechanisms engaging one by one, 12 of them, counting the rhythmic reverberations against the plasteel walls. When the final lock slammed home, the silence that followed was heavier than the ocean. It was a pressurized, artificial silence, devoid of the wind, the groans of the dead, or the shifting rubble that had formed the soundtrack of our lives for the last decade. I stood there, frozen, my rifle raised but pointing at nothing but pristine, seamless white panels. My breathing was ragged, harsh and metallic inside my helmet, the sound amplified by the sudden claustrophobia of the space. We were no longer in the cavernous hive. We had been swallowed. The transition from the amber gloom of the incubation chamber to this sterile artery of the machine was violent to the senses. The light here was aggressive. It didn't just illuminate, it erased shadows. It came from everywhere and nowhere, diffusing through the walls themselves, a cold, shadowless luminescence that made my eyes water and my pulse hammer against my temples. Seal confirmed. Miller gasped, his voice tinny and wet over the comms. Sarge, the air pressure, do you feel that? I did. My ears popped painfully, a sharp crackle of cartilage that signaled a rapid equalization. The suit's external sensors on my wrist display were scrolling through data so fast it was a blur, but one reading stood out in flashing green. Asterisk pathogen count 0. Asterisk the air in this corridor wasn't just filtered, it was scrubbed. It was cleaner than any air I had breathed since before the collapse. It smelled of ozone and ionized metal, a scent so chemically pure it felt caustic in my lungs. I lowered my weapon slightly, the barrel trembling not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline crash that was beginning to liquefy my muscles. Check your seals, I ordered, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears, too loud in the dead air. We don't know what kind of decontamination protocols this place has. If it decides we're foreign contaminants, it might just burn us out. Vance was already moving, walking slowly toward the wall. He reached out a gloved hand, hesitating inches from the surface before making contact. It's warm, he whispered. The walls are warm. Like skin. I stepped up beside him. The material wasn't metal. It was a composite, smooth as glass but with a faint, yielding give under pressure. Under the intense white light, I could see microscopic veins of circuitry running beneath the surface, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic luminosity that mimicked a heartbeat. The entire corridor was alive. We weren't walking through a building, we were walking through an artery of a living organism made of synthetic biology. We need to move, I said, pulling away from the wall. The feeling of it made my skin crawl, a primal revulsion bubbling up from my gut. That door won't hold forever if the system decides to purge this sector. We find a control node, we find a map, and we figure out how to kill this place. We began to walk. The pace was agonizingly slow. Every footfall of our heavy combat boots clanged with a dull, muffled thud that seemed to be swallowed instantly by the corridor. The design of the place was maddening. There were no visible seams, no rivets, no maintenance panels. It was a continuous tube of white, curving gently to the left, preventing us from seeing more than 50 meters ahead at any time. It felt endless, a loop designed to break the mind before it even broke the body. As we trudged forward, the details of our own wretchedness became magnified against the backdrop of this perfection. I looked at Miller's armor. It was caked in 10 years of grime, dried mud, grease, the black ichor of the dead, scratches from rebar and claws. In this hallway, we looked like viruses. We were the infection. The juxtaposition was jarring. We were the survivors, the heroes of our own story, but in here, we looked like filth dragging itself across a sterile countertop. About 200 meters in, the corridor widened. To our left, the seamless white wall was broken by a viewing port, a massive pane of ballistic glass stretching from floor to ceiling. I held up a fist, signaling a halt. Clear, Vance murmured, sweeping the area behind us. I approached the glass. It was thick, multi-layered, distorting the view slightly at the edges. I leaned in, shielding the glare of the corridor lights with my hands, and looked into the room beyond. My breath hitched in my throat, freezing into a solid lump of ice. It was a laboratory. But not the kind with beakers and white coats. It was an industrial processing center. The room was vast, tiled in gray slate, with drains running along the floor that were stained a dark, rusty brown. Suspended from the ceiling were robotic armatures, slick with oil and fluids, hanging limp and dormant. But it was what lay on the stainless steel tables that stopped my heart. They were zombies. The shamblers. The rot walkers we had spent a decade slaughtering. There were dozens of them, strapped down with surgical precision. But they weren't being studied for a cure. They were being disassembled. I saw a torso, gray, emaciated, the skin sloughing off, clamped open with retractors. The organs were missing. Not eaten but harvested. Beside the table, on a pristine metal tray, lay a heart that was still beating, wired into a portable life support module. It wasn't the erratic, sluggish beat of a dying infected, it was strong. Powerful. "They're recycling them," Miller whispered, stepping up beside me, his voice trembling so violently the audio clipped. "Oh God, Sarge! They aren't the enemy. They're the raw materials." I stared at the horror beyond the glass. It made a sickening kind of sense. The zombies on the surface, they never starved. They never truly decayed past a certain point. They kept moving, kept hunting, fueled by an energy source we never understood. Now, looking at the machinery hooked into that harvested heart, I realized why. The virus, or whatever it was, didn't just reanimate dead tissue. It fortified it. It turned biological matter into a renewable energy source. The surface was just a free-range farm. The hordes weren't an apocalypse, they were a crop. And this facility was the harvest. "Those towers," I said, my voice low and dark, fueled by a rage that burned hotter than the fear. "The things in the towers. The giants. They're being built out of parts. They're stitching the best pieces of the infected together to make monsters." Vance pointed to the far end of the laboratory. "Look at the door. The big one at the back." I squinted, adjusting the zoom on my visor. At the back of the lab, there was a massive cargo airlock. Above it, stenciled in stark, military block letters, was a designation that made the blood drain from my face. Project Archangel. Destination, surface deployment. Status, pending. Deployment. I repeated the word, tasting the ash of it. "They aren't just guarding this place. They're preparing to leave it." A soft chime echoed through the corridor, a pleasant, ascending three-note tone that sounded like the announcement for a subway train. The lights in the corridor shifted from blinding white to a soft, pulsing amber, the same color as the incubation tanks. "Biological contaminants detected in Corridor 4 Alpha," a voice spoke. It was a woman's voice, calm, synthetic, and terrifyingly polite. Asterisk. "Please discard all contaminated gear and proceed to the incinerator for sterilization. Failure to comply will result in localized purge. You have 30 seconds to comply." Asterisk. The walls began to hum. The floor beneath our boots started to vibrate. Along the baseboards of the corridor, small vents slid open with a synchronized clack, and I could hear the hiss of gas beginning to cycle up. "Run!" I yelled, breaking the paralysis. "Don't look back! Just run!" We sprinted. The heavy thud of our boots became a chaotic drumroll. The pleasant voice continued to count down, *25, 20, as the amber lights began to flash in time with the count. The gas hadn't hit us yet, but I could see the distortion in the air near the floor, a heavy, colorless vapor rolling out of the vents like dry ice. The corridor curved sharply again, and we careened around the bend, shoulder-checking the wall. Ahead, the seamless white tube ended. It terminated in a heavy blast door, painted with yellow and black hazard stripes. Beside it was a control panel, its screen glowing with a dormant red standby icon. "Miller! The panel!" I shouted, leveling my rifle back down the corridor at the creeping wall of gas that was chasing us. Miller threw himself at the console, his gloved fingers fumbling with a hardline interface cable from his suit. "I can't hack this, Sarge. It's military encryption. It's high-level command codes. Bypass it," Vance screamed, watching the gas count down. Asterisk. 10 seconds. Asterisk. "I can't. It needs a biometric key. It needs a handprint, or a retinal scan." I looked back at the gas. It was 10 meters away, moving with a sentient hunger. Then I looked at the panel. A flat glass scanner plate. A biometric lock. My mind flashed back to the surface. To the kneeling zombie. The one that had looked at me. The one that had smiled. And the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The DNA. The genetic markers. If this facility was harvesting them, if it was using them. I didn't think. I reached into my utility pouch, my fingers closing around the cold severed finger I had taken from the kneeling zombie, a grim trophy I had cut loose in a moment of morbid curiosity before the fall. I hadn't told the others. I had just taken it. Move! I shoved Miller aside and slammed the severed, graying digit onto the glass plate. 5-4. The scanner flashed a laser across the dead flesh. A red beam scanned the fingerprint, the ridges, the genetic code embedded in the rot. 3. The light on the panel turned green. Asterisk. Access granted? Welcome back, Lieutenant Colonel Sterling. Asterisk. The blast doors hissed and began to groan open. We threw ourselves through the gap, tumbling onto a metal grating just as the gas slammed against the other side of the closing door. We lay there in the dark, gasping, the sound of the seal locking behind us once again. But the silence in the new room was different. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the low, steady hum of servers. Sarge, Miller whispered, staring at me in the gloom, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear. That voice, it called you Sterling. The zombie's finger, it belonged to Colonel Sterling? I looked at the severed finger in my hand, then at the name stitched onto my own chest plate. My name wasn't Sterling. But the machine thought the zombie was. No, I said, looking up into the darkness of the new room, where rows of blue lights were flickering to life. Sterling was the commander of Sector 7. That zombie, that thing on the surface, that was the commander. We weren't just in a hive. We were in a tomb where the dead were still in charge. The hiss of the hydraulic seal locking into place behind us severed the world in two. On one side, the corridor of blinding white light and deadly gas. On the other, where we now lay collapsed on a vibrating metal grate. A suffocating darkness that smelled of ozone and supercooled air. For a long moment, the only sound in the universe was the ragged, desperate sawing of our own breath. I could hear the fluid rattling in Vance's lungs, a wet, heavy sound that echoed off unseen walls. My own heart was hammering against my ribs with such violence that my vision pulsed in rhythm with it, black spots dancing in the gloom. I didn't try to stand. I couldn't. The adrenaline that had carried me through the sprint was evaporating, leaving behind a leaden heaviness in my limbs. I rolled onto my back, the metal grating biting into the synthetic fabric of my suit, cold and unforgiving. I unclenched my right hand. It was stiff, the muscles cramping from the death grip I'd held for the last 3 minutes. As my fingers curled open, the object rolled onto the mesh floor with a dull, wet thud. The severed finger of Lieutenant Colonel Sterling. It lay there in the dark, a grotesque silhouette against the faint ambient light of the control panel we had just bypassed. It was gray, the skin leathery and desiccated, the nail bed turned a bruised purple-black. A jagged shard of bone protruded from the knuckle where I had severed it with my combat knife days ago, a lifetime ago, on the surface. It was just meat and bone, rotting slowly, yet it felt heavy, as if it possessed a gravitational pull of its own. Sterling, Miller whispered again. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the finger, his face illuminated by the faint red glow of his suit's biomonitor. The fear in his voice wasn't the panic of the chase anymore. It was a cold, creeping intellectual horror. Sarge, the readout on the door, it didn't just accept the biometric data. It welcomed him. It recognized the genetic degradation and still logged him as active command. I sat up, groaning as my spine popped. I reached out and snatched the finger back, shoving it deep into my utility pouch, sealing the Velcro flap with a harsh rip that made Vance jump. It's a key, Miller. Nothing more. Don't anthropomorphize the dead. But that's just it. Miller stammered, scrambling to his knees, his eyes wide and glassy. The system shouldn't accept necrotic tissue. Biometric scanners look for heat, for blood flow, for pulse. That scanner, it bypassed the vitals check. It only looked for the DNA sequence. It was programmed to accept a corpse. I stared at him, the implications settling over me like a shroud. Miller was right. High-security facilities didn't just check fingerprints, they checked for life. Unless this facility was designed, from the very beginning, to be operated by things that were no longer alive. Get up, I ordered, my voice sounding hollow in the vastness of the room. We're not safe here. We need to assess the environment. Vance was already sweeping his rifle light across the space, but the beam was swallowed by the sheer scale of the darkness. Sarge, I can't see the ceiling. And the walls, they're too far out. As if responding to his voice, the room began to wake up. It started as a low-frequency vibration in the floor, buzzing through the soles of our boots, shaking the dust from our uniforms. Then, with a sound like a massive turbine spinning up, the lights engaged. They didn't snap on. They ignited in sequence, row after row, stretching away from us into an impossible distance. But they weren't the harsh, clinical white lights of the outer corridors. These were a deep, throbbing cobalt blue. We stood frozen, dwarfed by the architecture of the machine. We were standing on a suspended gantry, a narrow metal walkway floating above a drop that fell away into blackness. Stretching out in front of us, rising like monoliths in a graveyard, were thousands of server racks. They were arranged in perfect, symmetrical columns, towering 30 feet high, their status lights blinking in a chaotic, synchronized dance of amber and green. The air here was freezing. I could see my breath pluming in front of my face in jagged clouds. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in seconds. It was a server farm, but on a scale that defied logic. This wasn't just data storage for a research lab. This was enough processing power to simulate a universe. Sector 7. Vance breathed, lowering his weapon, the barrel tipping toward the floor. What needs this much memory? What are they keeping here? Not what? Miller said, walking toward the railing of the gantry, his gaze fixed on the endless rows of blue-lit towers. Who? I moved up beside him, the metal railing freezing cold under my gloves. Explain. Miller pointed a trembling finger at the nearest server bank. It was close enough to touch, a black monolith humming with terrifying power. On the side of the casing, stenciled in white military-grade paint, was not a serial number, but a designation. Asterisk subject, A492. Status, archived/dormant. Asterisk. Look at the next one, Miller said, his voice dropping to a whisper. I looked. Asterisk subject, A493. Status, archived/dormant. Asterisk. And the next? Asterisk subject, A494. Status, active deployed surface. Asterisk. My stomach turned over. I gripped the railing, leaning out over the abyss. The rows went on forever. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. Each tower wasn't just a hard drive, it was a file. A dossier. A life. These aren't just servers, I said, the realization tasting like copper in my mouth. They're cataloging them. Every zombie on the surface. Every creature in the tunnels. They aren't random mutations. They have serial numbers. We need to access a terminal, Miller said, snapping out of his daze. The puzzle was overriding his fear now. He was a tech, give him a problem, and he could function. If I can bridge into the local loop, I can see what the central processor is doing. I can see what they're guarding. Do it, I said, turning to watch R6. Vance watched the door. If that gas clears, or if that voice decides to open the blast doors, we need to know instantly. We moved further along the gantry. The walkway suspended us over the cooling pit, a deep chasm filled with churning fans the size of aircraft engines, pushing the freezing air up through the server racks. The sound was hypnotic, a constant, rhythmic whoosh thrum that sounded alarmingly like a massive, mechanical lung breathing. About 50 meters down the walkway, the gantry widened into a central observation node. A semicircle of monitors sat dormant on a desk of brushed steel. A single, high-backed chair sat before them, turned away from us, facing the sea of blue lights. I raised my fist, signaling a halt. I approached the chair slowly, rifle raised, safety off. The leather of the chair was cracked and old. I nudged it with the barrel of my weapon, spinning it around. Empty. But on the seat lay a clipboard, thick with dust. I picked it up, blowing the gray powder away. The top sheet was a manifest, dated 3 years ago. Asterisk batch 112 cognitive transfer complete. Physical degradation within acceptable parameters. Deployment authorized by Sterling. Asterisk. Miller, I said, tossing the clipboard onto the desk. Get in. Now. Miller sat in the chair, his hands hovering over the interface. It was a flat glass surface, identical to the door scanner. He looked up at me, hesitating. I can't, he said softly. It's biometric lockout again. It's the whole system, Sarge. Everything is keyed to the command staff. I didn't hesitate this time. The revulsion was still there, but it was buried under layers of necessity. I reached into my pouch and withdrew the severed finger. It was colder now, stiff as wood. I handed it to Miller. He took it gingerly, holding it by the exposed phalanx bone, trying not to touch the dead skin. He pressed a fingerprint onto the console. The desk hummed. The monitors flared to life, casting a harsh white glow over Miller's pale face. Lines of code cascaded down the center screen, moving too fast to read. Then, the scrolling stopped, replaced by a rotating 3D schematic of the facility. Okay, Miller muttered, his fingers flying across a holographic keyboard that projected into the air. Okay, I'm in. I'm bypassing the security subroutines, masking our presence as a routine diagnostic cycle. We have maybe 5 minutes before the main AI realizes a dead man is typing. Find out where we are, I said, scanning the shadows above the server racks. I had the unshakable feeling we were being watched. Not by cameras, but by something else. The shadows between the racks seemed to deepen, to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. We're in the cortex, Miller said, his eyes darting across the data. Level 4. It's the central data repository for Project Lazarus. Sarge, look at this. He tapped a key, and one of the side monitors expanded a video feed. It was grainy, black and white, showing a different part of the facility. It looked like a nursery, or a hospital ward. Rows of glass tanks, filled with amber liquid. Inside the tanks were people. Floating. Sleeping. But they weren't like the things on the surface. They looked pristine. Healthy. Is this live? Vance asked, creeping up behind the chair. Yeah, it's live, Miller said. Sector 7 Delta. It's 2 levels below us. But look at the vital signs overlays. I leaned in. Next to each tank on the screen was a scrolling list of biometrics. Heart rate 0. Brain activity 0. Respiration 0. They're dead, I whispered. Physically, yes, Miller said, his voice trembling. But look at the data stream connecting to the tanks. It's coming from here. From this room. From these servers. He pointed to the main screen, where a thick line of data connected our location to the room full of tanks. The servers aren't just storing files, Miller said, turning to look at me, horror dawning in his eyes. They're streaming consciousness. The people in those tanks, their bodies are dead, preserved in suspension. But their minds? Their memories? They're in here. In the servers. I looked back out at the endless rows of blue lights. The scale of it crushed me. It wasn't a database. It was a city. A digital afterlife constructed of silicon and cooling fans. So the zombies on the surface. I started. Rejects, Miller finished. Failed uploads. Or maybe bodies that woke up without a signal. Empty vessels running on autonomic instinct. The Guardians aren't guarding a weapon, Sarge. They're guarding the backup drive. They're guarding the souls of the people who built this place. Suddenly, the hum of the room changed pitch. The soothing blue lights shifted instantly to a violent, pulsing crimson. The gentle whir of the cooling fans ramped up to a screaming whine. Unauthorized data access detected. The polite woman's voice returned, booming from speakers hidden in the darkness above. Asterisk. Biometric anomaly detected. Command code Sterling is registered as deceased. Identity theft protocol initiated. Asterisk. Identity theft protocol? Vance shouted, spinning around, rifle raised. Miller, cut the connection. I yelled. I can't. It locked me out. Miller scrambled back from the desk as the holographic keyboard turned red and vanished. From the far end of the gantry, where the darkness was deepest, a sound emerged. It wasn't the slow shuffle of the zombies we knew. It was the heavy, rhythmic clang of metal on metal. Fast. Precise. Heavy. Asterisk clang. 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 Asterisk. Something was sprinting down the metal walkway toward us. Something big. Contact front! I screamed, dropping to one knee and sighting down the gantry. Light it up. Vance triggered his weapon-mounted flashlight. The beam cut through the red gloom, illuminating the path ahead. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. It looked like a man, wearing the tattered remains of a dress uniform, command staff. But where the head should have been, there was a sleek, chrome visor fused directly into the neck. And where the arms ended, there were no hands. The limbs had been surgically removed at the forearm, replaced with high-frequency thermal blades that glowed with a searing white heat. It didn't scream. It didn't moan. It moved with the terrifying silence of a machine, its metal feet denting the grating with every step. Fire! I roared. We opened up. The roar of our rifles was deafening in the enclosed space. Muzzle flashes strobed, lighting up the server room like a disco from hell. Bullets sparked off the creature's chest plate, ricocheting into the servers. Sparks showered down like rain. The thing didn't stop. It didn't even flinch. It lowered its head, the chrome visor gleaming, and accelerated. It was closing the distance, 50 meters, 40, 30. It's armored! Vance yelled, reloading with frantic hands. Standard rounds aren't penetrating. I looked around wildly. We were trapped on the gantry. The only way out was back the way we came, which was sealed, or forward, through the machine man. Then I saw it. To our left, a maintenance hatch in the floor of the gantry, marked with yellow hazard tape. Asterisk coolant flush access. Asterisk. The hatch. I grabbed Miller by the harness and threw him toward it. Open the hatch. The machine thing was 20 meters away. I could feel the heat radiating from its blade arms. It raised one limb, preparing to slice through us like we were wet paper. Miller yanked the release lever. The hatch groaned, rusted shut. Help him! I shouted at Vance, firing a concentrated burst at the creature's legs, trying to break its stride. One bullet found a joint, and the creature stumbled, a spray of black hydraulic fluid mixing with dark, congealed blood hitting the floor. It shrieked then, a sound that was half human scream, half digital feedback. Vance and Miller kicked the hatch together. With a screech of tearing metal, it gave way, swinging open to reveal a dark chute angling steeply downward. Go! 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 Miller jumped. Vance followed. The creature recovered, lunging for me. The thermal blade slashed through the air where my head had been a fraction of a second before. I felt the heat singe my eyebrows. I didn't try to fight. I rolled backward, tucking my chin to my chest, and let gravity take me into the black throat of the chute. As I slid into the darkness, the last thing I saw was the creature standing at the lip of the hole, bathed in the flashing red light. It didn't pursue. It simply stood there, watching. And in the split second before the darkness swallowed me, I saw the name engraved on its chest plate, just below the chrome visor. Major General Casper. We weren't just fighting security. We were fighting the board of directors. The sensation of falling was not the weightless, stomach-churning drop of a nightmare, but a violent, abrasive friction that tore at the very fabric of my reality. The chute was a steep, spiraling intestine of galvanized steel, slick with the residue of decades of industrial condensation. We were not sliding so much as we were being digested, tumbled blindly through the throat of the facility. My boots struck the sidewalls, the impact jarring my teeth, while the darkness pressed against my eyes with a physical weight. The air rushing past my ears didn't howl, it hissed, carrying the metallic tang of ozone and the cloying, sweet stench of chemical coolant. It was a descent into the underworld, stripping away the tactical logic of the server room above and replacing it with the primal chaos of gravity and speed. Time distorted in the blackness. It could have been seconds or minutes before the angle of the chute began to level out, transitioning from a vertical drop to a horizontal sluice. My speed bled away in a series of bruising impacts against the corrugated metal, until finally, I was spat out into empty space. I flailed, grasping at nothing, before plunging into a liquid freezing enough to seize the breath in my lungs. The shock was absolute. The cold was a physical blow, a million needles piercing every inch of exposed skin. I thrashed, my heavy gear dragging me down, boots seeking purchase on a floor that felt slimy and uneven. I breached the surface, gasping, inhaling a mist that tasted of copper and ammonia. My tactical light, still clipped to my vest, was submerged, casting an eerie, refracted aquamarine glow through the murky fluid. "Sound off!" I choked out, my voice sounding small and hollow in the vastness of the chamber. "Here." Vance's voice came from the left, tight with pain. "I'm here." "Miller?" A frantic splashing answered me. "I can't touch the bottom. I can't, something touched my leg." I waded toward the sound of his panic, the liquid swirling around my waist. It was thick, more viscous than water, clinging to my fatigues like oil. "Calm down, Miller. Find a footing. It's just debris." I hauled him up by his harness, feeling him trembling violently against the freezing soak. We were standing in a drainage catchment, a concrete basin filled with the runoff of the facility's cooling systems. I pulled my rifle clear of the sludge, shaking the fluid from the optics, and raised the beam to survey our new prison. The light cut through the rising steam, revealing a space that defied the architectural logic of the upper levels. We were in the bowels of Sector 7. The ceiling was lost in a haze of condensation, miles above us, it seemed. Massive pillars of reinforced concrete, thick as redwood trunks and stained with rust and algae, marched off into the gloom. Between them ran a labyrinth of pipes, some narrow as veins, others large enough to drive a truck through, pulsing with a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the liquid around our legs. It sounded less like machinery and more like the respiration of a sleeping god. "What was that thing?" Miller whispered, his teeth chattering so hard the words were barely intelligible. That wasn't infection. That was engineering." Vance spat into the water, a glob of dark phlegm. He wiped his face with a gloved hand, smearing the grime. "That was Casper. I served under him in the sandbox 3 years ago. He was a hard man, but he was human. That thing upstairs. That was a suit of armor made of flesh and steel." We waded toward the edge of the catchment basin, hauling ourselves up onto a rusted grate walkway that ran the perimeter. The air down here was frigid, a stark contrast to the fever heat of the server room. It smelled of stagnation and sterile maintenance fluid, a hospital scent mixed with the damp rot of a sewer. I checked my weapon. The action was sluggish with the cold sludge, but it cycled. "They didn't just lock the doors to keep the dead out," I said, my voice low. I shined my light on a series of conduit bundles running along the wall. They were marked with color-coded tape, pristine despite the decay around them. "They stayed down here. They kept working. Look at the maintenance dates on these junction boxes. 6 months ago. 6 months after the fall. Vance noted, checking his own gear. So someone is still maintaining the power grid. Or something is. We moved forward, boots squelching on the grating. The walkway led us away from the drainage pool and deeper into the forest of pipes. The acoustic profile of the room was oppressive. Every scuff of our boots echoed, multiplying into a phantom army marching in step with us. The silence between those echoes was heavy, filled with the dripping of condensation and that pervasive, subsonic thrum. As we pushed deeper, the environment began to change. The industrial brutalism gave way to something more precise, more clinical. The pipes converged, feeding into a central aisle flanked by towering glass cylinders. They looked like the fermentation tanks of a brewery, but the scale was monstrous. Each tank was 3 meters tall, filled with a cloudy, amber liquid that was backlit by a faint, pulsating luminescence. I approached the nearest tank, wiping the condensation from the glass with my forearm. The light from my rifle reflected off the curved surface, struggling to penetrate the murk inside. Slowly, shapes began to resolve within the amber suspension. I recoiled, my breath catching in my throat. Floating inside the tank, suspended in the fluid, was a human figure. It was stripped naked, its skin pale and puckered from long-term immersion. But it wasn't just a body. Thick, black cables were drilled directly into the skull, creating a halo of wires that floated like Medusa's snakes. More cables entered the spine at the base of the neck, and translucent tubes were threaded into the major arteries of the arms and thighs. The figure's eyes were open. They were milky white, the corneas clouded over, staring blindly out into the darkness of the walkway. But every few seconds the eyelids twitched. The fingers curled and uncurled in a slow, rhythmic spasm. "Dear God," Miller breathed, standing beside me. He was looking at the readout panel attached to the base of the tank. The digital display was active, scrolling lines of code in rapid amber text. "Is it alive?" Vance asked, his weapon lowered, the barrel pointing at the floor as if he couldn't bear to aim at the victim. Miller tapped the glass, his fear momentarily forgotten in the face of the technological horror. "Define alive." "The heart is beating, driven by a pacemaker. The lungs are oxygenated by fluid. But the brain, look at the neural activity." He pointed to a graph on the display that was spiking wildly. "This isn't a coma. This isn't hibernation. The brain is running at 300% capacity. It's seizing. Constantly." I looked down the aisle. There were hundreds of tanks. Row after row, fading into the darkness. Hundreds of people. "It's a processor," Miller said, his voice trembling with a realization that seemed to physically sicken him. "They aren't trying to cure the virus. They're utilizing it." "Utilizing it how?" I asked, tearing my eyes away from the floating figure. "The virus reanimates necrotic tissue," Miller explained, his hands hovering over the keypad, terrified to touch it. "It bypasses the conscious mind and hotwires the motor functions and the aggressive centers of the brain. It creates a biological machine that doesn't need sleep, doesn't feel pain, and is incredibly resilient. Someone figured out how to harness that. They're using the infected brains as wetware. Organic parallel processing." I looked back at the figure in the tank. The wires in its head pulsed with a faint blue light, synchronized with the scrolling data. It wasn't a patient. It was a component. "That explains the heat," Vance murmured. "The server room upstairs. It wasn't just cooling the digital servers. It was cooling the runoff from this. The whole facility, it's a computer. A computer made of people." We stood in silence, surrounded by the hum of 1,000 enslaved minds. The realization shifted the entire paradigm of our survival. We had thought the zombies were the plague, the enemy to be eradicated. But here, in the heart of Sector 7, they were the fuel. The guarding force upstairs, the Major General with the blade arms, he wasn't guarding a vault of gold or a stockpile of medicine. He was guarding the battery. "We need to keep moving," I said, my voice hardening. The shock was crystallizing into a cold, burning rage. If this is the engine room, the control center has to be close. And whoever turned these people into calculators is going to answer for it. We advanced down the aisle, the amber light of the tanks casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic bubbling of the aeration pumps. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not by cameras, but by the thousands of unseeing eyes floating in the glass. Their collective subconscious screaming into the network. At the end of the hall, the walkway terminated at a massive blast door. It was circular, resembling the airlock of a submarine, stamped with the logo of the Aegis Corporation. But someone had spray-painted over the logo a single word, scrawled in red paint that had long since dried to the color of rust. *Hive. Miller, can you open it? I asked, posting up beside the frame. Miller examined the control panel. It was smashed, the wires torn out. Electronic access is dead. But there's a manual override wheel. It'll take 2 of us. Vance slung his rifle. On 3. We gripped the cold steel of the wheel. It was immense, taller than I was. 1, 2, 3. Heave! We strained against the mechanism. For a moment, nothing happened. The metal groaned, the sound of immense friction protesting against years of stasis. Then, with a screech that sounded like a dying animal, the wheel turned. A hiss of equalizing pressure blasted out, blowing dust and stale air into our faces. The door swung inward, revealing not a room, but a cavern. We stepped through, our flashlights barely making a dent in the gloom. We were standing on a high gantry overlooking a natural cavern that had been hollowed out and reinforced. In the center of the cavern, suspended over a chasm that dropped away into infinite blackness, was a structure that looked like a pulsating heart. It was a massive knot of cables, tubes, and biological matter, fusing metal and flesh into a single, throbbing entity the size of a house. And standing on the bridge leading to it, facing away from us, was a solitary figure. It wore a white lab coat, pristine amidst the filth. It didn't turn as the heavy doors slammed open. It just stood there, taking notes on a clipboard, as if the apocalypse outside was nothing more than a variable in an experiment. "Don't shoot," the figure said, the voice amplified by the acoustics of the cavern. It was a human voice. Calm. Cultured. "I've been waiting for a new sample group. The current batch is degrading." The figure turned slowly. It was a woman, middle-aged, wearing wire-rimmed glasses. She looked like a librarian, or a grandmother. Except for the fact that half of her face was missing, revealing the gleaming titanium skull beneath. And her left eye was a glowing red optic lens that zoomed in on us with the whir of a camera shutter. "Welcome to the core," she said, smiling with the half of her mouth that was still flesh. "Please try not to damage the hardware. We have deadlines to meet." The echo of her voice didn't die away naturally. It seemed to be swallowed by the gelatinous hum of the machine suspended in the void. I kept my weapon trained on her center of mass. Though the logic of ballistics felt laughably inadequate against a woman whose skull was reinforced with aerospace-grade titanium. The red optic lens in her left socket whirred again, a tiny, insect-like sound that scraped against the silence of the cavern. It dilated, contracting and expanding as it mapped our biometrics, stripping us down from human beings into raw data points. Heart rate, cortisol levels, caloric potential. Miller was the first to move, though it wasn't in advance. He took a half-step back, his boots grinding on the metal grating of the gantry. I could hear his breathing, ragged and wet, through the calms of our survival instinct, even if we weren't speaking. The air in this cavern was different from the hallway. It didn't smell like rot or death. It smelled like ozone, burning hair, and the distinct, copper tang of electrified blood. It was the scent of a thunderstorm trapped inside a morgue. "Identify yourself," Vance barked. His voice was steady, the granite calm of a man who had decided long ago that he was already dead, but the tension in his forearms betrayed him. The veins stood out like cords of wire as he gripped his rifle, the knuckles white. He didn't aim at her head. He aimed at the fleshy part of her torso, the only vulnerability she seemingly advertised. The woman tapped the clipboard with a pen that looked like a surgical scalpel. She didn't look at Vance. She looked past him, staring into the infinite blackness above us where the ceiling should have been. Identity is such a fluid concept down here, isn't it? Up there, in the sunlight, you have names, ranks, social security numbers. Here, you are simply potential energy waiting to be harvested. But if you require a label to facilitate this interaction, you may refer to me as Director Kale. I was the chief of neurology for Aegis before the restructuring. Restructuring. A polite, corporate euphemism for the apocalypse. I stepped forward, moving away from the blast door, my eyes scanning the environment. The gantry we stood on was a narrow spine of rusted steel, suspended by thick chains over a chasm that dropped into nothingness. To my left and right, massive bundles of cabling, thick as tree trunks, ran from the walls into the central mass. But they weren't just rubber and copper. As my flashlight beam cut through the gloom, the light caught the glistening sheen of biological material. The cables were wrapped in translucent membranes, pulsing with a milky fluid. Inside the tubes I saw shapes. Vertebrae. Femurs. Lengths of intestine woven with fiber optic lines. The structure in the center, the heart, the core, whatever she called it, was an abomination of geometry. It was the size of a cathedral dome, a writhing knot of machinery and meat. It beat with a slow, wet thud that vibrated through the metal grating under my feet, a rhythm that was dangerously hypnotic. Every thud was accompanied by a flash of amber light from deep within the tissue, illuminating the silhouettes of bodies fused into the surface. They weren't floating in tanks anymore. They were the architecture. "You're processing them," Miller whispered, the horror finally finding its way out of his throat. "The people in the tanks, the ones upstairs. You're not curing them. You're not even studying them. You're using their brains as processors." Director Kale smiled again, that half-flesh, half-metal expression that landed squarely in the uncanny valley. She finally lowered the clipboard, clasping her hands behind her back. "The human brain is the most efficient computational device in existence. Infinite parallel processing power, self-repairing neural pathways, low energy consumption. The only flaw is the ego. The self. It creates latency. It creates hesitation. We simply remove the software conflict." She gestured casually to the abyss around us. "The zombies, as you call them, are merely the perimeter firewall. They are the unrefined nodes, useful only for brute force defense. But the ones here? The ones integrated into the core? They are the chorus. They are calculating the future of the human race." "There is no future here," I said, the words tasting like ash. "Just a slaughterhouse run by a calculator." "On the contrary," Kale replied, her robotic eye spinning as she focused on me. "We are solving the ultimate equation. Resource scarcity, climate collapse, war. The hive mind has run millions of simulations. The only variable that consistently leads to extinction is free will. So, we are archiving it." The sheer insanity of her calm was more terrifying than the Major General upstairs. The creature with the blade arms was a monster, yes, but it was an animal acting on instinct. Kale was something worse. She was the banality of evil, digitized and optimized. She looked at us not with malice, but with the detached interest of a butcher sizing up a side of beef. "Vance," I murmured, barely moving my lips. "On my mark. We take the bridge. If she twitches, put a round in her organic eye." "Copy," Vance breathed. But Kale heard. Or perhaps she anticipated. The wires connecting to her titanium skull pulsed with a sudden surge of blue light. The ambient hum of the cavern changed pitch, rising from a low thrum to a piercing whine that drilled into our molars. "Resistance is the first variable we isolate," she said, her voice layering over itself, sounding like two people speaking in unison, one human, one synthetic. "You have arrived at an opportune moment. One of our primary logic nodes has burned out. We have a vacancy." Suddenly, the bridge beneath us groaned. I grabbed the handrail, the cold metal biting into my palm. The entire gantry lurched, tilting 5 degrees to the right. From the darkness below, the sound of movement erupted, not the shambling drag of the undead, but the precise, mechanical clanking of hydraulics and wet slap of flesh on metal. "Watch your six!" Miller screamed, pointing his pistol back toward the blast door. I spun around. The blast door hadn't closed, but something was emerging from the shadows of the hallway we had just left. It wasn't a horde. It was a single entity. It looked like a man, stripped of skin, his musculature wrapped in clear plastic sheeting. Where his head should have been, a server rack was bolted directly into the neck, blinking with green status lights. A camera lens protruded from the center of the rack, focusing on us. "The custodian," Kale announced, her voice echoing from everywhere at once. "He maintains the physical integrity of the bridge. He does not appreciate visitors." We were trapped. The custodian blocked our retreat, a nightmare of flayed muscle and silicon. Ahead, Kale stood guarding the core, the abyss waiting on either side. The atmosphere in the cavern grew heavier, the pressure dropping as the giant heart in the center began to beat faster. Thud thud. Thud thud. The amber lights within it flared brighter, revealing the faces of the damned trapped in the biomatter. Their mouths open in silent screams that powered the network. "Don't let them take me," Miller said, his voice cracking. He wasn't talking to us. He was pleading with the universe. "I can't end up like that. I won't be a spare part." "Nobody is becoming a spare part today," I growled, flicking the safety off my rifle. The fear was gone now, replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. This was the center of the web. The place where all the suffering coalesced into a single point. I looked at the massive knot of cables above the custodian's head, the support lines that held the bridge to the cavern wall. If we couldn't go back, and we couldn't go forward, maybe we could go down. Not into the abyss, but onto the maintenance subgrid I could just barely see illuminated by the flashing lights below. "Vance!" I shouted over the rising mechanical whine. "The suspension cables! Shoot the anchors!" Vance didn't hesitate. He didn't ask why. He swung his rifle up, the barrel flashing in the dark. The gunfire was deafening in the enclosed space, a staccato hammer pounding against the eardrums. Sparks showered down like fireworks as his rounds impacted the heavy steel coupling holding the bridge to the cliff face. Director Kale's expression shifted for the first time. The human side of her mouth frowned. "Illogical," she stated. The bridge groaned, a sound like the earth splitting open. Then, with a crack that vibrated in the marrow of my bones, the anchor gave way. The floor beneath us dropped. Gravity is a constant until it isn't. In that split second, when the steel anchor sheared away from the cavern wall, the world didn't just drop, it unraveled. The bridge, a 1,000-ton ribbon of industrial walkway, ceased to be a floor and became a terrifying, swinging pendulum. The sensation was sickening, a lurch in the gut that felt like my stomach was trying to exit through my throat. There was no screaming, the noise of the collapse was too overwhelming for human vocal cords to compete with. It was a cacophony of shrieking metal, the high-pitched snap of tension cables whipping through the air like angry vipers, and the thunderous boom of concrete dust exploding outward. We slid. It wasn't a straight fall into the abyss, but a chaotic, angled descent. The metal grating I had been standing on tilted to a 45-degree angle, transforming into a serrated slide. I scrambled for purchase, my gloves tearing against the diamond plate steel, sparks showering around us like a cascade of dying stars. Above us, the blast door and the horrified, frozen silhouette of the custodian shrank away, swallowed by the rising plume of debris. For a heartbeat I saw Kale. She hadn't moved. She stood at the precipice of the severed walkway, her hands clasped behind her back, watching us fall with the same impassive curiosity she might accord a drop of rain running down a windowpane. Then impact. It wasn't the graceful landing of an action hero. It was brutal, jarring, and ugly. The remains of the bridge slammed into the maintenance subgrid 50 feet below, the metal groaning in protest as it crumpled against the reinforced girders. The force threw me sideways, my shoulder colliding hard with a rusted stanchion. The breath left my body in a single, agonizing whoosh. Darkness washed over my vision, swimming with phosphine bursts of purple and white, triggered by the shock to my nervous system. For a long time, there was only the ringing in my ears. It was a high, sustained tone that drowned out the ambient thrum of the facility. I lay there, cheek pressed against the cold, vibrating metal of the subgrid, waiting for the feeling to return to my extremities. Slowly, the ringing faded, replaced by the terrifyingly loud sound of my own ragged breathing and the drip, drip, drip of something liquid hitting the floor nearby. "Vance?" I rasped. The words scraped my throat raw. The air down here was different. Up on the main bridge, it had been sterile, recycled. Here, in the bowels of Sector 7, the air was thick, humid, and heavy. It tasted of ozone, hydraulic fluid, and something copper-sweet, the unmistakable scent of old, congealed blood. "Clear!" came the voice, tight but steady. A beam of tactical light cut through the swirling dust clouds. Vance was crouched 10 feet away, his rifle already up, scanning the shadows. He looked like a statue dusted in gray ash, his eyes the only living thing in a face of stone. "Miller? Sound off." There was a whimpering sound from beneath a tangled mess of cables that had fallen with us. I pushed myself up, wincing as my bruised shoulder protested. We scrambled over the debris, pulling aside thick, rubberized conduits that felt disturbingly warm to the touch. Miller was curled in a fetal ball, clutching his pistol to his chest so hard his knuckles were white. He wasn't injured, at least not physically, but his eyes were wide, staring at nothing, vibrating with a panic that threatened to shatter him completely. "Get up, Miller," I whispered, grabbing his vest and hauling him to his feet. He felt light, insubstantial, as if the fear had hollowed him out. "We aren't dead yet. Don't do the enemy's work for them." He blinked, focusing on me, then looked up into the darkness from which we had fallen. The amber glow of the core above cast long, skeletal shadows through the grating of the subgrid. We were underneath the heart of the machine now. The perspective was daunting. From here, the core didn't look like a computer or a generator. It looked like a nest. Looking around, the maintenance level was a labyrinth of claustrophobic catwalks and service tunnels, suspended over a darkness so deep it seemed to have physical weight. But it was the walls that drew my attention. They weren't just concrete. Large, translucent pipes, thick as tree trunks, ran along the perimeter, pulsing rhythmically. Inside them, a viscous, bioluminescent sludge moved sluggishly toward the center of the cavern. I stepped closer, wiping the dust from a section of the pipe with my glove. The liquid inside was a pale, milky green, illuminated by the facility's emergency lighting. Suspended in the fluid were chunks of organic matter, identifiable shapes that made my brow rise. A finger. A terrifyingly preserved jawbone. A patch of gray skin with a tattoo still visible. "Jesus Christ," Vance whispered, appearing at my shoulder. "It's a feeding tube." The realization hit us with the force of a physical blow. The zombies above, the hordes wandering the wasteland of Sector 7. They weren't just guarding the facility. They were the livestock. The raw material. Kale wasn't just controlling them, she was harvesting them. The entire facility was a digestion system, breaking down the undead biomass to fuel whatever calculations the core was running. "We need to move," I said, turning away from the horrific slurry flowing through the pipes. The nausea was rising, but I forced it down, compartmentalizing the horror. There would be time to vomit later. If Kale knows we survived, she'll send the custodian down. We need to find a service hatch, something that leads to the core's interface without going back up to the bridge. We moved single file, stepping carefully on the grating to avoid making noise. The environment was hostile in a way that felt personal. Steam hissed from ruptured valves, scalding the air. The heat was oppressive, sweating the moisture out of us within minutes. Every shadow seemed to twitch. The architectural geometry down here was all wrong, angles that didn't make sense, machinery that looked like it had grown rather than been built. Wires were woven into the metal like veins, pulsing with faint blue light that synchronized with the beating of the core. Thud thud. Thud thud. The sound was louder here, vibrating through the soles of our boots. It felt less like a machine and more like we were walking across the ribs of a sleeping giant. Miller stopped suddenly, freezing in his tracks. He raised a shaking hand, pointing toward a junction in the catwalk ahead. "Listen," he breathed. I strained my ears against the industrial hum. At first I heard nothing. Then, beneath the grinding of gears and the hiss of steam, I heard it. A wet, slithering sound. Like wet leather being dragged across sandpaper. And it was coming from below the grating we were standing on. I signaled for lights out. We plunged into the amber gloom, crouching low. I peered through the mesh of the floor. 10 feet below us, on a secondary support strut, something was moving. It wasn't human. It was a maintenance drone, but not of any design I had ever seen in a manual. It looked like a spider made of human rib cages and optical sensors. It scurried along the underside of the pipes, its multi-jointed limbs searching for leaks, welding them shut with small, precise bursts of laser fire. It paused directly beneath us. Its head, a cluster of camera lenses mounted on a spinal column, rotated 180 degrees. Looking straight up at the underside of our catwalk. The aperture of the main lens dilated, focusing. It was hunting for heat signatures. I held my breath, my lungs burning. A single drop of sweat rolled down my forehead, stinging my eye, but I didn't blink. Beside me, Vance was a statue, his hand hovering over his knife. A gunshot would be too loud. It would bring the whole hive down on us. If that thing spotted us, we'd have to take it apart with our hands. The drone chirped, a sound like a dial-up modem screaming in pain, and a red laser grid scanned the metal beneath my boots. The light played over my toes. I willed my heart to stop beating, willed my body temperature to drop. After an agonizing eternity, the drone chittered to itself, apparently satisfied that we were just debris, and scuttled away into the darkness. Its limbs clicking rhythmically against the steel. Too close, Vance exhaled, the tension leaving his frame in a shudder. "We're in the immune system now," I murmured, standing up slowly. "That thing was a white blood cell. We're the infection." We pushed forward, deeper into the tangled guts of the machine. The catwalk ended at a heavy, circular bulkhead door, stained with rust and grease. A wheel valve sat in the center. It looked like the airlock of a submarine. Above it, a stenciled sign, barely legible under layers of grime, read processor coolant intake / biomatter conversion. "This is it," I said, examining the wheel. "This leads inside the casing of the core. If we can get in there, we can plant the charges directly on the processor. And if we open it," Miller said, his voice hollow, "do we drown in that soup? It says intake." I reasoned, though I wasn't sure. "That implies suction. Airflow. Or fluid flow. Either way, it's a way in." I gripped the wheel. It was cold, greasy. I braced my feet and heaved. The metal groaned, protesting decades of disuse. Vance stepped in beside me, adding his strength. Together, we strained, muscles trembling, veins popping in our necks. With a screech of tortured iron, the wheel turned. Once. Twice. The seal broke with a hiss of pressurized gas that smelled of ozone and decay. The door swung inward, revealing not a room, but a tunnel. It was lined with thousands of server blades, blinking rapidly in the dark, bathed in a freezing mist. But the walls of the tunnel weren't metal. They were flesh. Gray, necrotic, synthetic flesh, fused with the circuitry. We stared into the throat of the beast. The line between man and machine hadn't just been blurred here, it had been erased. The walls were breathing. "After you," I said to Vance, raising my rifle. We stepped across the threshold, leaving the ruins of the bridge behind, and walked into the living nightmare of Sector 7's true mind. The air inside the tunnel was not merely cold, it was devoid of life, yet paradoxically thick with the stench of it. We stepped across the threshold, and the heavy bulkhead door swung shut behind us with a wet ceiling thud that vibrated through the soles of my boots. We were sealed in. The darkness here was absolute, save for the rhythmic, strobing pulses of the server blades lining the curved walls. But to call them walls was a desperate attempt to cling to the sanity of engineering terms. They were organic husks, a gray, undulating matter that felt less like steel and more like callous tissue grown over a broken bone. I raised my rifle, the flashlight beam cutting a cone through the mist. The vapor hanging in the air wasn't steam. It was heavier, clinging to our visors in oily droplets that refracted the light into greasy rainbows. I wiped my glove across my faceplate, smearing the condensation. It left a reddish residue. The coolant was aerosolized hemoglobin mixed with synthetic lubricants. We were breathing the mist of processed blood. "Watch your footing," I whispered, my voice sounding dampened and flat, absorbed instantly by the spongy material surrounding us. The floor curved upward at the edges, forming a perfect tube. Underfoot, the grating had been subsumed by the growth. What looked like cables running the length of the tunnel were actually massive, hardened arteries, pulsing with a slow, pressurized lethargy. Every time my boot landed, the surface yielded slightly, a sickening give that made me feel as though I were walking on a bruised lung. Miller was hyperventilating. I could hear the sharp, jagged intake of his breath over the comms loop. He was a man of circuits and logic, of blueprints and schematics. This aberration of biology and technology, was an affront to everything he understood about the world. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering over a bank of blinking diodes embedded directly into a patch of necrotic muscle. "Do not touch it," Vance hissed, his voice tight with a disciplined terror. He kept his weapon trained down the center of the spiraling corridor, his shoulders hunched as if expecting the ceiling to crush us. "Look at the wiring," Miller stammered, ignoring the warning. He didn't touch it, but he leaned in close, his eyes wide behind his lenses. "It's not soldered. It's grafted. The fiber optics, they're woven into the nerve endings. The latency would be zero. It's a neural network, but on an industrial scale." I grabbed Miller by the shoulder strap of his rig and pulled him back to the center of the path. "Keep moving. If we stop, we start thinking about it. If we think about it, we scream." We trudged forward. The tunnel was a gullet, spiraling gently downward toward the center of the sector. The soundscape was oppressive. Gone was the mechanical grinding of the upper levels. Here, the noise was wet. A sloshing, rhythmic churning, like being inside the stomach of a leviathan that was slowly digesting a city. The walls expanded and contracted in time with the sound, a peristaltic motion that squeezed the freezing mist past us, pushing us deeper. Time lost its meaning. We might have walked for 10 minutes or 10 hours. The repetition of the scenery, flesh, light, wire, flesh, light, wire, was hypnotic. It lulled the mind into a trance of repulsion. I found myself focusing on the minute scratches on the receiver of my rifle. Anything to avoid looking at the periphery of my vision where the shadows seemed to writhe. Then, the texture of the tunnel changed. The smooth, gray biomass began to look lumpy, uneven. I slowed my pace, raising a fist to halt the team. I directed my light at the wall to my left. I wished I hadn't. Embedded in the wall, fused seamlessly with the structure, was a face. It was stretched, distorted, the skin pulled taut like canvas over a frame. The eyes were gone, replaced by glowing red optical sensors that swiveled independently. The mouth was sewn shut with silver wire, but the jaw worked silently, grinding teeth that were no longer there. It wasn't just a face, it was a component. A human CPU, stripped of consciousness and repurposed for processing power. And it wasn't alone. As I swept the beam further down the tunnel, the walls became a mosaic of agony. Limbs, torsos, faces, hundreds of them, thousands of them, melted together, their individual identities erased to serve the machine. This was where the missing population of Sector 7 had gone. They weren't guarding the facility. They were the facility. Vance made a sound in his throat, a low growl of revulsion. God, look at them. They're dormant. Processing mode. Miller whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely articulate the words. They aren't thinking. They're calculating. The zombies upstairs, the ones wandering the halls, those are just the rejects. The ones that didn't take the graft. These are the successful integrations. One of the faces near my shoulder twitched. The optical sensors in its sockets dilated, focusing on the light of my torch. A low, static-filled whine emitted from a speaker embedded in its throat. It was trying to communicate, or perhaps it was just venting excess heat. Don't look at them, I commanded, forcing my eyes forward to the black void at the end of the tunnel. Eyes front. Focus on the mission. We plant the charges, we kill the brain, we leave. We can't kill this, Miller said, sounding close to tears. It's everywhere. We're standing inside a living creature the size of a city block. Then we give it a heart attack. I snapped. The tunnel began to narrow. The walls pressed in, the ceiling dipped lower. We were forced into a crouch, scraping our packs against the weeping ceiling. The fluid dripping down was thicker now, viscous and dark. The smell of copper was overwhelming, tasting like a bloody penny placed on the tongue. The heat began to rise, dispelling the cold mist, replaced by a humid, tropical swelter that made the sweat pour down my back. We were getting close to the core. The heat signature was spiking. We emerged from the constriction into a slightly wider chamber, a junction point. Here, 3 similar tunnels fed into a massive, vertical shaft. We stood on the lip of a precipice, looking down. It was a silo, cylindrical and vast, dropping down into an abyss of red light. In the center of the shaft, suspended by thick, fleshy cables that looked like umbilical cords, hung the processor. It was a sphere, 30 feet in diameter, pulsating with a violent, erratic rhythm. But it wasn't made of silicon or steel. It was a giant, beating heart, armored in chitinous plating and bristling with antennas. The cables feeding into it throbbed, pumping the bioluminescent fluid we had seen earlier. Every pump sent a shockwave of sound through the air, a bass thrum that rattled my teeth. Target acquired, Vance said, but his voice lacked its usual steel. He was staring at the cables. I followed his gaze. The cables weren't just tubes. They were translucent. Inside the thick, gelatinous outer layer, I could see bodies sliding down toward the central sphere. They were being fed into it. Whole bodies, dissolving as they moved, broken down into raw biological data to fuel the computations of the core. That's the biomatter conversion, I realized, the horror finally settling in my gut like a stone. The zombies aren't guarding a secret weapon. They are the fuel source. The system eats them to keep running. It created the virus to harvest more material. Miller fell to his knees, overcoming by the scale of the atrocity. It's an engine. He wept. It's just an engine that runs on people. I unslung the satchel charge from my back, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I had to force my fingers to work, to remember the muscle memory of setting the timer, of priming the detonator. The air was so thick with humidity, and the smell of raw meat that I gagged, swallowing back bile. Vance, I choked out. Cover me. I'm setting the charges on the primary suspension cables. If we cut the feed, the heart starves. Vance nodded, turning his back to the pit, facing the tunnel we had just exited. He raised his rifle, clicking the safety off. Do it fast. The walls. I think they know we're here. He was right. The tunnel behind us was changing. The blinking lights on the server flash had turned from a passive amber to an angry, rapid-fire crimson. The low moan of the air circulation had shifted into a high-pitched shriek. The antibodies were coming. The immune system had found the infection, and it was sending everything it had to purge us. I jammed the plastic explosive into the wet, fleshy crevice where the nearest cable anchored to the platform. My fingers slipped on the slime. I could hear the skittering again, the sound of the bone spiders, the maintenance drones. But this time, it sounded like hundreds of them, pouring down the intake tunnels, a tidal wave of clicking limbs and laser cutters. 30 seconds! I yelled, keying the sequence. Miller, get up. We need to move. Miller didn't move. He was staring into the pit, mesmerized by the beating heart. It's beautiful, he whispered, his mind finally snapping under the pressure. It's the perfect synthesis. I grabbed his collar and hauled him up, slapping him hard across the helmet. The impact rattled him, bringing a spark of recognition back to his eyes. Run now, admire later! I shouted, shoving him toward the maintenance ladder that climbed up the side of the shaft, our only way out. Leading up toward the ventilation exchange. Vance opened fire. The muzzle flash strobed in the dark, illuminating the horror rushing toward us from the tunnel. They weren't just drones anymore. The walls themselves were tearing open, birthing half-formed monstrosities, wet and screaming, clawing their way out of the architecture to stop us. Fire in the hole! I screamed, not referring to the charge, but to the grenade I lobbed into the tunnel mouth to buy us time. The explosion was deafening in the confined space, spraying gore and metal across the platform. We scrambled for the ladder, the heat of the core burning our backs, the screams of the facility rising to a deafening crescendo. We had started the chain reaction. Now we just had to survive the death throes of a god made of meat. The ladder was cold, a freezing counterpoint to the sweltering, rot-heavy air rising from the abyss below. But it was slick with a condensation that felt more like sweat than water. My gloves coated in the viscous black residue of the facility's inner workings, struggled for purchase on rungs that felt less like steel and more like calcified bone, grown directly out of the shaft's ribbed walls. Every upward heave was a battle against gravity and the overwhelming, primal urge to simply let go, to surrender to the hypnotic, thrumming rhythm of the processor below. 10 feet up. The sound of Vance's rifle was deafening in the vertical echo chamber, a rhythmic barking that punched holes in the oppressive humidity. I didn't look down. I couldn't. To look down was to see the source of the madness, that pulsating sphere of meat and chitin, swallowing the liquefied remains of the dead to calculate the next iteration of the apocalypse. Instead, I focused on the rivets of the ladder, staring at the way the rust bloomed around them like dried blood. Or perhaps it actually was dried blood. At this depth, the distinction between machine and organism had not just blurred, it had ceased to exist. Keep moving! Vance roared, his voice cracking under the strain. Below us, the wet tearing sound of the walls giving birth intensified. It sounded like thick canvas ripping, amplified 1,000 times. The facility was waking up. It wasn't just defending itself, it was reacting with the violent, flailing panic of a wounded animal. The shaft shook, a convulsion that rattled my teeth and slammed my chest against the ladder. Dust, or dander, or spores, rained down from the darkness above, coating my visor in a gray film that smelled of ozone and singed hair. I reached down and grabbed Miller's harness, hauling him upward. He was dead weight, his limbs moving with a sluggish, mechanical compliance, but his mind was gone. left behind on that platform staring at the engine of bodies. He was muttering, a low, feverish stream of consciousness that bled into the comms. Optimization ratios. 90% biomass efficiency. The soul is just data. The soul is just fuel. Climb, Miller! I screamed, the desperation tearing at my throat. I slammed my boot onto the rung beneath his, forcing him to find footing. Don't you look at it. Eyes up. We were 30 feet up now, suspended in the throat of the beast. The air grew thinner yet heavier, laden with the metallic tang of the antibodies swarming below. I risked a glance, just for a fraction of a second, to gauge the distance of the pursuit. The platform we had just fled was gone, submerged under a writhing carpet of pale limbs and glistening steel mandibles. The maintenance drones, those spider-like horrors, were climbing the walls, their laser cutters tracing burning orange lines across the biomechanical flesh of the shaft. They moved with a terrifying, insect jitter, bypassing gravity as they scuttled upward, closing the distance with unnatural speed. But they weren't the worst of it. The larger things, the hulking, misshapen forms that had pulled themselves free from the womb sacs in the tunnel walls, were climbing the ladder itself. I saw a hand, huge and skinless, clamp onto the bottom rung. It had too many fingers, fused together in a fleshy paddle, and where the wrist should have been, a hydraulic piston hissed, driving the limb forward. It was a desecration of anatomy, a brute force marriage of biology and industry. Vance fired again, a 3-round burst that sparked brightly against the darkness. The creature on the ladder let out a sound that wasn't a scream. It was a burst of static, a digital screech of error code broadcast through a wet, organic larynx. It fell, tumbling back into the pit, crashing into the mass of drones below, but 3 more took its place. They were relentless. We were a virus, and the white blood cells were coming to scour us from the vein. Explosives set for 20 seconds. I yelled, checking the chrono on my wrist. The numbers counted down with agonizing slowness. 19. 18. The red digits seemed to mock the frenetic chaos of our ascent. The heat was becoming unbearable. As the processor pumped faster below, agitating the fluid in the cables, the ambient temperature in the shaft spiked. My suit's cooling systems whined in protest, the warning icons flashing amber on my HUD. Sweat stung my eyes, blurring my vision, mixing with the grime on my face. Every breath was a struggle, sucking in air that felt like it had been cycled through a blast furnace. My muscles burned, lactic acid flooding my limbs, turning my arms into lead weights. Grab. Pull. Step. Grab. Pull. Step. The rhythm was the only thing keeping me sane. I focused on the texture of the rungs, the pitting of the metal, the slick residue. I focused on the sound of Miller's ragged breathing over the radio. I focused on the impacts of Vance's bullets hitting flesh and metal below. Vance! How far back? I shouted, my lungs heaving. Too close, came the reply, followed by the metallic click of an empty magazine. Reloading. Go. Don't wait for me. We don't leave anyone, I retorted, though the logic of survival screamed otherwise. We were near the top of the section now. I could see the maintenance hatch above, a circular iris of rusted steel that marked the transition to the ventilation exchange. It was closed. Locked. I reached the top of the ladder and braced my legs against the sides of the shaft, freeing my hands to work the manual override wheel. It was immense, coated in decades of grime and that ubiquitous biological slime. I gripped it, my gloves slipping, and heaved. Nothing. It was seized tight. 10 seconds! I screamed, panic finally piercing through the adrenaline. Miller, help me! Miller hung on the ladder just below me, staring at the wheel. For a moment I thought he wouldn't move, that he would simply let the fire take us. Then, something flickered in his eyes, not hope, but perhaps a rigorous adherence to logic. If the hatch didn't open, the equation ended. He reached up, his hands trembling, and grabbed the spokes of the wheel. Together, we pulled. I gritted my teeth so hard I felt a molar crack. The veins in my neck bulged against the collar of my suit. "Come on, you piece of junk!" I roared. With a screech of tearing metal and snapping tendons, whether the hatches or the facilities, I couldn't tell, the wheel turned. A quarter rotation. Then half. The iris groaned and began to retract, revealing a dark, cramped crawlspace above. Cool air, relatively speaking, rushed down to meet us, smelling of stagnant water and rust. It was the sweetest perfume I had ever encountered. "Get in! Go!" I shoved Miller into the hole. He scrambled through, his movements frantic now that escape was tangible. I looked down. Vance was 10 feet below, firing his sidearm now, the rifle slung across his back. A drone had leaped onto the ladder, its cutter spinning inches from his face. He kicked it, his boot connecting with the sensor cluster, sending it spinning into the void, but another was right behind it. "Vance! The charge!" I screamed, extending a hand down into the shaft. 5. 4. Vance looked up. His helmet was cracked, a spiderweb fracture across the faceplate. Behind it, his eyes were wide, filled with a terrible realization. He wasn't going to make the climb in time. Not before the blast. Not before the swarm overtook him. "Close the hatch," Vance said. His voice was calm. Terrifyingly calm. "No! Take my hand!" I lunged deeper, hanging precariously over the edge of the abyss. "Close it, or the blast wave kills you both," Vance said. He stopped climbing. He jammed his legs through the rungs, locking himself in place, forming a human barricade against the horrors surging up from the deep. He raised his pistol, aiming not at the monsters, but at the cluster of bioluminescent cables running along the wall next to him, the secondary feeds we had missed. 3. 2. "Vance! Finish the mission," he whispered. Then he fired into the cables. Explosive decompression of the pressurized fluid knocked him sideways, but he held his grip. The spray of glowing blue liquid coated the oncoming swarm, blinding the sensors, gumming up the gears. In the same second, the satchel charge at the base of the processor detonated. It wasn't a fiery explosion like in the movies. It was a concussive upheaval of physics. The sound didn't travel, it simply existed, everywhere at once, a hammer blow to the entire structure. The air in the shaft turned white. The pressure wave rushed upward, a physical wall of force moving faster than thought. I didn't close the hatch. The blast did it for me. The shockwave slammed the heavy steel iris shut just as the wall of heat and debris smashed against it from below. The impact threw me backward into the ventilation tunnel. I tumbled through the darkness, hitting walls, pipes, and unrecognizable machinery, rolling over and over until I slammed into Miller, bringing us both to a groaning halt in the dark, wet silence of the upper vents. For a long time, there was no sound but the ringing in my ears, a high-pitched tone that masked the world. The floor beneath us shuddered, a deep, resonant vibration as if the entire facility was groaning in pain. The heart attack had begun. I lay there in the dark, staring at the rivets on the ceiling, gasping for air that tasted of dust and death. My hand was still outstretched, reaching for a soldier who was no longer there. The heat from the floor began to radiate upward, cooking the metal beneath us. The explosion hadn't killed the facility, it had just made it angry. And now, we were trapped in its veins, with the fever rising. The heat arrived before the sound returned. It was a creeping, insidious warmth that radiated upward through the steel floor plating, pressing against the chest and thighs like a branding iron wrapped in velvet. The explosion deep in the bowels of Sector 7 hadn't just destroyed the processor, it had ignited the very blood of the facility. I lay face down in the darkness, the grit of oxidized metal grinding against my cheek, waiting for the ringing in my ears to subside. It was a high, piercing keen, a singularity of sound that obliterated all other senses. I couldn't hear Miller breathing. I couldn't hear the facility collapsing. There was only the white noise of neural shock. Slowly, the world filtered back in, not as a rush, but as a jagged series of sensory assaults. The smell came first, acrid ozone, the sick sweet scent of vaporized coolant, and the undeniable copper tang of blood. Then, the vibration. The rivets beneath my gloved fingers were humming, a low-frequency tremor that traveled up my arms and rattled my teeth. The beast wasn't dead. It was convulsing. We were inside the arteries of a dying titan, and the cardiac arrest was shaking the foundations of the earth. "Miller," I croaked. The word felt like swallowing broken glass. The air in the ventilation shaft was thick with dust, old particulate matter that had settled decades ago, now disturbed by the violence below. It coated the back of my throat, a dry, suffocating layer of history. There was no answer. I forced my eyes open, blinking against the stinging sweat that ran from my forehead. The darkness was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against the corneas. I fumbled for the tactical light on my shoulder mount. My fingers felt numb, distant, as if they belonged to someone else. With a clumsy swat, I hit the activator. A beam of stark, white light cut through the gloom, illuminating a tunnel of galvanized steel that stretched endlessly forward. It was a coffin, elongated and twisting, barely 3 feet high. Miller was curled in a fetal ball 2 yards ahead of me. His suit was scorched, the fabric on his back melted into a rigid black carapace. He wasn't moving. I dragged myself forward, my elbows scraping against the floor, every inch a negotiation with pain. My right leg dragged behind me, dead weight, the muscles potentially torn from the sprint to the ladder. When I reached him, I grabbed his shoulder harness and shook him. The movement was weak, lacking the command authority I usually projected, but it was enough. He gasped, a terrible, ragged intake of air that sounded like a vacuum seal breaking. He thrashed, his hands clawing at the walls of the shaft, his eyes wide and unseeing in the glare of my light. "We're moving," I whispered, the volume of my voice irrelevant in the tight space. "Miller, look at me. The floor is getting hot. If we stay here, we cook." He blinked, the panic slowly receding behind a wall of trauma. He looked past me, back toward the way we had come, back toward the sealed hatch. "Vance," he murmured. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of deficit. The equation was unbalanced. "Forward," I commanded, ignoring the ghost he was staring at. "Move." We began the crawl. It was an agonizingly slow process. The ventilation system was a labyrinth of right angles and steep inclines. We were rodents scurrying through the architecture of a nightmare. The heat continued to rise, turning the air into a shimmering haze. Sweat pooled inside my suit, boiling against my skin. Every breath was a labor, drawing in air that felt too heavy to process. As we moved, the beam of my light played across the walls of the tunnel. I began to see things I had missed in our descent. Scratches. Deep, gouged furrows in the steel. They weren't from tools. They were from claws. Fingers. The metal was scarred with the desperate, frantic attempts of things trying to hold on against a powerful airflow. And there were markings, faint, stenciled warnings under the grime. "Biological stasis exhaust only. Do not block." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, slowing my crawl. We had thought the zombies, those biomechanical horrors patrolling the corridors, were guarding a weapon. We thought they were soldiers protecting a treasure. But as I looked at the claw marks, at the desperate gouges leading away from the core and toward the surface, the truth realigned itself in my mind. They weren't guards. They were inmates. Sector 7 wasn't a fortress, it was a prison. Or perhaps, a lifeboat that had gone terribly wrong. The creatures hadn't been patrolling to keep us out, they were patrolling to keep the containment integrity. They were the immune system of a sick body, attacking anything that threatened the stasis of the core. And we had just killed the heart. "Miller, stop," I hissed. He froze, his boots inches from my face. We had reached a junction. The tunnel split left and right. To the left, the air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of rot. To the right, there was a faint, almost imperceptible draft. A current. Right, I said, my voice cracking. Go right. The tunnel angled upward sharply. The climb was torture. Gravity, sensing our exhaustion, doubled its pull. My fingernails tore inside my gloves as I pulled my weight up the incline, my boots scrambling for purchase on the slick metal. Below us, deep in the earth, a dull boom resonated through the shaft. Another secondary explosion. The facility was collapsing in on itself, floor by floor. We were racing the structural failure of a mountain. Miller stopped abruptly. Light, he whispered. Turn off the light. What? Miller, turn it off. His voice was a frantic hiss. I killed the beam. Darkness slammed back into us, instantaneous and total. But as my eyes adjusted, seeking patterns in the void, I saw it. Up ahead, perhaps 50 feet, there was a grayness. Not light, exactly, but a dilution of the dark. A grate. We scrambled toward it, the heat at our backs now intense enough to blister skin. The roar from below was growing louder, a grinding cacophony of tearing metal and crushing concrete. The vibration was constant now, shaking the tunnel so violently that my shoulders slammed repeatedly against the narrow walls. Miller reached the grate first. He shoved against it. It didn't budge. It's rusted shut! He screamed, the panic finally breaking through his logical shell. He slammed his shoulder into the iron mesh. It won't move. I crowded in behind him, the space so tight our bodies were pressed together in a claustrophobic embrace. I could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. Move aside, I growled, though there was nowhere for him to go. I jammed my boot against a rivet on the wall and wedged my shoulder under his arm, pressing my back against the grate alongside him. On 3, I yelled over the rising roar of the collapse. 1, 2, 3. We heaved. My vision blurred with the effort. Every tendon in my legs screamed. The grate groaned, a screech of tortured iron, and then, with a crack that sounded like a gunshot, the hinges gave way. The grate flew outward, and we tumbled with it, spilling out onto cold, hard ground. I rolled, gasping, my lungs seizing as they were hit by freezing, clean air. It was night. We were outside. I scrambled to my feet, dragging Miller up by his collar. We were in a dense forest, the trees stark and bare against a moonless sky. Behind us, embedded in the side of a rocky hill, was the camouflaged exhaust port we had just exited. Run! I commanded. We stumbled away from the hill, crashing through the underbrush, tripping over roots. Fueled only by the primal need to distance ourselves from the epicenter. We made it perhaps 200 yards before the ground beneath us turned to liquid. We fell to our knees as the earth convulsed. I looked back at the hill. It wasn't exploding outward. It was imploding. The ground above Sector 7 simply dropped, a massive sinkhole opening up and swallowing the forest whole. Trees, rocks, and the exhaust port we had just crawled through vanished into a cloud of rising dust and debris. The sound was a low, mournful groan, the sound of the earth swallowing a secret it could no longer keep. Then silence. The dust cloud settled slowly in the moonlight. We sat there for a long time, shivering in the cold, the heat of the tunnels rapidly fading from our suits. Miller stared at the crater, his face streaked with soot and tears. It's gone, he whispered. The data. The samples. Vance. It's all gone. I looked at my hands. They were trembling uncontrollably. I thought about the claw marks in the vents. I thought about the way the zombies had moved, not with malice, but with a desperate, programmed efficiency. No, I said softly, the realization settling over me like the cold ash falling from the sky. We didn't destroy the threat, Miller. We destroyed the cage. I looked out into the dark woods surrounding us. The silence was too deep. Too heavy. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. It wasn't the wind. The mission is over, I said, reaching for the empty holster at my hip, a phantom reflex for a weapon I no longer had. Now survival begins.